The year 2017 was the second full year of our ownership of Teal, a 36-foot Hardy motorboat. After Dairne's stroke in 2012, we had struggled on for a while sailing our beloved Rustler 36 Ariadne, in which we had sailed some 36,000 miles since 1995, when she was built, but mainly since my retirement in 2001. It simply wasn't working, so with great reluctance we sold Ariadne and purchased Teal. So far, the adventures in Teal had been confined to the Solent, so when the Royal Southern Yacht Club announced that it was organising a cruising company to the Bay of St Malo, we started to think about the possibility of joining them. Dairne's balance and mobility had been severely impaired by the stroke, and her ability to move about the boat when it was moving in anything other than flat calm water had become severely restricted. Could she undertake the passage of several hours across the channel? We simply did not know, but decided we would give it a try. There were two precautions we took. The first was to decide that we would not cross the channel unless the sea conditions were smooth or slight. The second was that we asked a friend Rowena, who had been at college with Dairne, to come with us so that Dairne would have a companion even at times when I was occupied handling the boat. With those rules set, the preparations were made, and we settled down to watch the weather develop during the latter part of June, with the cruise scheduled to start on the 1st of July. On these maps, the green colours indicate winds of force 5 and above, while the inset chart from passage weather shows the sea climate. Only white and the palest blue would be good enough for us. Pat North, who was coordinating the cruise for the Royal Southern Yacht Club, announced that she would be going to Yarmouth on Thursday the 29th of June and crossing to St Peter Port on the Friday. We thought we might be able to get to Yarmouth, but were fairly certain that the conditions would not be suitable for us to cross on Friday, or even the Saturday. With less than a week to go, the outlook was not promising, with moderately strong winds in the channel producing seas that were slight to moderate and occasionally rough, especially towards the French coast. We were watching long-range forecasts produced by NetWeather and the swell forecasts produced by Passage Weather. We were beginning to have doubts as to whether we would be able to cross the channel at all. However, it looked as though conditions would moderate and settle after the weekend of the 1st and 2nd of July. We might not be able to keep up with the Royal Southern Fleet, but we would try to make at least the channel crossing. During the morning of 29th of June, I brought Teal alongside and loaded all except the perishable stores. Then I returned home to collect Dairne and Rowena, our other crew member. The last perishable stores, including a few pre-prepared meals, were distributed between the two fridges. Dairne's wheelchair was collapsed and stowed in its bag lashed to the taffrail. We were ready to leave by 14:45. It was an easy passage down Southampton Water to Calshot. With a strong northerly component in the wind, the passage down the West Solent was quite comfortable. After 2 hours we were alongside the fuel berth at Yarmouth, topping up our tanks. The weather was cold and slightly threatening, so we opted to stay on board for supper. Pat North was already in the harbour, and we spoke by phone. She would depart at first light to get to the Alderney race as the tide turned favourable. I confirmed that the forecast of northwest 4 to 5, becoming 5 to 6, with an occasionally moderate swell, especially near Guernsey, meant that we would only go to Studland and wait for the weather. She wished us luck, and we reciprocated. Friday morning started fairly grey and with a cold northerly wind blowing, ideal for the yachts that were heading towards the Alderney race. After breakfast, Rowena went for a walk in the village which she had not visited before, and got 1 or 2 items of shopping that had been missed. To go to Studland, we would wait for the tide to start to run to the west in the mid-afternoon, but rather than wait in Yarmouth, which was likely to get busy as the weekend approached, we left at 11:50 and trickled over to Keyhaven. The approach is shallow, but the tides were neap, and we had been in there many times with Ariadne, which has a 1.8 metre draft compared to Teal's modest 1.1 metres. The yacht on the next buoy tried to leave, but failed to recognise the channel markings and ran aground. Keyhaven is an attractive harbour but fairly exposed, and the salt marsh which protects it is being seriously eroded at an alarming rate. By 1600 the tide would be starting to run through Hurst Narrows in our favour, so we dropped the buoy and headed back out. Our route took us through the North Channel and then direct to Studland, easing slightly to seaward to try and avoid the fishing floats on Christchurch Ledge that were there to catch the unwary. We were hoping to be able to cross the channel the next day, so we anchored in Studland. A northwest wind is not the best direction for Studland, and the boat would be on the move all night. However, we were safe, and it is always an interesting place to be. As usual, I was awake in time to listen to the Coast Guard Maritime Safety Information broadcast at 07:30. I use a kind of shorthand based on that recommended by Alan Watts in his excellent weather books. The shipping forecast read, Thames, Dover, white. Northwest 5 to 6, becoming westerly 4 or 5. Slight or moderate, occasionally rough. Good, occasionally poor. This was not encouraging. Even though the winds would be behind us, moderate or occasionally rough seas, particularly as we approached the Channel Islands, would not be acceptable. The inshore waters forecast was a little more promising. It read, Selsey-Bill to Lyme Regis. Northwest 5 or 6, becoming west 4 or 5. Slight to moderate, becoming smooth or slight. Showers becoming rain or drizzle. Good, becoming moderate or poor. It looked as though conditions were improving, and the outlook was even better. West 4 or 5, becoming variable 3 or 4. Slight, occasionally smooth. Occasional rain or drizzle. Moderate, occasionally poor, becoming good. This confirmed an improving situation. We did not have direct access to the internet, but I was able to watch the BBC television forecast, which clearly indicated that a ridge of high pressure was on the way. Reluctantly, the decision was taken that we would delay our channel crossing by a further day. As Studland was slightly uncomfortable, we took the decision to move into Poole and go up to Goathorn Point, which would be much more sheltered. By 09:30 we were on our way at a leisurely pace and anchored at Goathorn Point an hour later. Already the weather was improving, the wind was dropping and the sun was coming out. Goathorn Point is a pleasant place to be and fairly quiet except for the occasional vedette and the supply vessel running to the oil drilling operation on Fursey Island. We spent a lazy day reading books, watching the occasional film or the tennis at Wimbledon. It was even warm enough for Dairne to spend some time on the afterdeck. That evening we were treated to quite a spectacular sunset. While the forecast for the 2nd of July showed that conditions were improving, there were signs that it would deteriorate thereafter. The decision on whether or not to cross the channel was therefore pivotal. I had spent some time during the evening trying to work out the best passage plan. The critical point when crossing the channel to Guernsey is the tide around Alderney. Even a quick glance indicated that a very early start would be the best plan, but I didn't fancy rousing the crew at first light, so I looked for an alternative. It would be nearly 7 p.m. before the tide went favourable in the Alderney race, making arrival time in Guernsey much later than I would have liked, so I sought an option that would allow an earlier arrival time. I noticed a detail in my tidal atlas that indicated a possible eddy that would give a favourable tide through the Swinge from about 5 p.m, and I opted to take advantage of that. I knew that the tide would be flooding up the channel during the afternoon and angled slightly against us, so I used a passage planning speed of 12 knots over the ground. Equally, the wind would be slightly against us, but I did not think it would cause too much of a problem. At 07:30 on the 2nd, I got the shipping forecast, which indicated that in the inshore waters area the sea would be slight or smooth, though it might be moderate further south near the Channel Islands. The crew agreed with me that we should give it a go, and we planned to weigh anchor at 12:30. This should get us clear of the Poole Channel by 1300 and ready for the cross-channel passage. At 12:30 we eased down the channel and started to speed up as we cleared the Sandbanks ferry. The water was pleasantly smooth as we sped past Old Harry and along the Purbeck coast. As we eased past Dirlston Point, heading south, we started to encounter rough water, and for the next hour it was rather like being thrown around inside a washing machine, the motion was so violent. At one point I asked Dairne whether we should turn back. Her reply was, that would be giving up. I was confident conditions would improve as I decided that what we were experiencing was the tail of the St Albans race being brought up channel by the flooding tide. As expected, after about an hour conditions began to improve and we were beginning to see commercial shipping appearing on the AIS plot. This picture, not taken on the day of our crossing, shows the typical shipping situation as you cross the channel. The traffic separation schemes at Ushant, the Caskets and Dover organised the commercial ships going to and from Europe into two distinct streams, rather like a motorway. So it was that after a couple of hours we encountered the west-going stream of ships. Being a Sunday, there were not too many ships about, and we threaded through quite easily. An hour later we encountered the eastbound ships, and again we were able to pass through quite well. Alderney was the first landfall we had made in our own boat since 2011, so it was quite a satisfying moment when the smudge of Alderney appeared in the haze ahead. As we had been making about 13 knots over the ground, we were slightly early, but we pressed on and found the tide in the Swinge was indeed favourable. At times our speed over the ground touched 17 knots as we sped through and on towards Guernsey. We had expected the water to get rough again as we cleared south of Alderney, and indeed it was slightly rougher, though nothing like the waves we had experienced in the first hour of our passage. To port, we could see Grandam Frock, a useful rock with a lighthouse on it that is a convenient transit for many passages going to and from the Russell Channels. In this photograph you can see Little Sark behind the rock and the Berkeley Brothers mansion clearly visible. When passage planning in the Channel Islands, I often check Malcolm Robson's pilot books for safe transits and views that I will encounter like this one. However, the books were written many years ago and one has to be careful. In this case, for instance, the Roustel beacon was destroyed some time ago and has been replaced by this much less elegant structure. Nevertheless, the general view helps to make sense of the jumble of marks that confronts you as you enter the Little Russell Channel. As we entered the Little Russell Channel, we found the Roustel beacon and then eased our way towards St. Peter Port. By 1910 we were alongside the cruise ship landing pontoon to which we had been directed by the harbour master. This was particularly convenient because it had a walk ashore facility. Rowena and I went straight to the nearby Guernsey Yacht Club where the Royal Southern Yacht Club had organised a dinner. We had been so uncertain about our channel crossing that we had not booked to take part. However, Rowena and I were made very welcome and given a glass of wine each. We chatted for a while and then returned to Teal, where we had supper on board. The Royal Southern Cruising Company was ready to move on to Treguier, and most boats would leave during the 3rd of July. We were not able to do so because, after a long passage during which Dairne could not take certain medications, we have to have a lay day so that she can restore the balance. We opted to move into Victoria Marina, partly to avoid being rafted out on the outer pontoons, and partly so that the passerelles would be shorter because of the smaller tidal range. Rowena and I went for a walk around the town, picking up a few essential bits and pieces on the way. We also identified a good restaurant for the evening and booked a table. Dairne needed a restful day, so much of the afternoon was spent watching the tennis at Wimbledon on our little television. In the evening, we took the wheelchair up the passerelle and trundled Dairne round to an excellent restaurant right by the harbour side called Mora. Dairne and Rowena shared a generous seafood platter. Then we returned to the boat for the rest of the evening. It would be the middle of the day before we would be able to get out of the Victoria Marina, so we could look forward to a lazy morning. On the morning of the 4th, I tried to contact the Royal Southern boats that had remained in Guernsey, but by the time I had walked round to the outside pontoons, I found the boats locked, and it was clear that the owners had already gone ashore for the day. We enjoyed an excellent lunch at the Pier 17 restaurant, which was located just at the head of the passerelle near the boat. Shortly after lunch, there was enough water for us to move out, and we relocated to the fuel berth and topped up the tanks. On leaving the fuel berth, we opted to return to the cruise ship pontoon to avoid being trapped on the walk ashore pontoons when we wanted to leave the following morning. In the meantime, I had been doing some passage planning with the idea of joining the Royal Southern cruise at Poole. On checking the pilot books, I was reminded that during the one and only visit we had made to that port, we had found the finger pontoons to which we would be moored rather narrow and rather bouncy. That would make it impossible for Dairne to get off the boat. Also, I had been looking ahead at the weather and had come to the conclusion that the present spell of settled weather would last until the 9th or 10th of July, but was likely to deteriorate thereafter. This implied that we needed to plan the return channel crossing no later than the 9th of July, with the 10th as a possible reserve. We thought of going instead to St Cast, which was probably the next destination for the Royal Southern Rally, but decided that it would mean 2 fairly long days motoring and would put time pressure on the overall timetable. We therefore opted to go down to Jersey on the following day and try and find our friends Fay and George, who had been our neighbours when we had lived there. While this consideration was going on, we heard on the VHF that a yacht was being towed into St Peter Port with engine trouble, and recognised that Chatterbox was one of the Royal Southern Fleet. By VHF, we contacted her and suggested that she should lay alongside us, as this would give good access to the engineering companies. In due course, Chatterbox came alongside us, and we were happy to renew our friendship with David and Deborah. Sadly, the required spares were not available in Guernsey, and the boat was eventually towed into the Victoria Marina, and the crew returned to England on the ferry. After all the excitement, we settled down for a quiet evening, ready for a fairly early start on the following morning. The morning of the 5th of July started very sunny with light winds. Jersey radio was giving northeast 3 to 4, increasing to 5 in the late afternoon. Crucially, the sea would be smooth or slight with no swell, ideal conditions for a passage. However, passage weather indicated that we might encounter a swell from the east as we rounded the southeast corner of Jersey. By 1100 we left St Peter Port and headed down towards Jersey at about 15 knots. On the way we passed a yacht reaching beautifully in the northeast wind, and we were quite envious. But a few minutes later Teal suddenly stopped. The engines were still revving quite hard. I quickly worked out what had happened. I had accidentally switched off the power to the throttle system, and the engines had immediately shifted into neutral, but the throttles had not moved. This was quickly corrected, and we were on our way again. Quite quickly we were approaching Jersey and heading towards the Corbière lighthouse on the southwest corner. Eventually we reached the turning point and slowed to go gently along the south coast of Jersey. We had the tide under us, but the brisk easterly wind against it was kicking up quite a lot, and there was a lot of spray being thrown over the boat. It was not too uncomfortable inside the saloon. Quite soon we were passing St Brelard's Bay, and eventually we could see the rather ugly property developments that had taken place. After passing Noirmont Point, we headed towards St Helier. By 1320 we were alongside the waiting pontoon in St Helier harbour. With our shallow draught we were one of the first boats to be invited to go into the marina, and found ourselves a comfortable berth right at the head of the marina. That evening we all went ashore with Dairne in the wheelchair, and we trudged our way round to St Helier Yacht Club, where we had a good meal. The next morning, 6th of July, would be a lay day. Rowena and I went ashore and meandered around the town and found it extremely difficult to buy reasonably priced wines, but in the end we succeeded. Amazingly, the best buy was a case of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc purchased at M&S. We were going to meet George and Fay, our neighbours, when we had lived in Jersey. Rowena went off on her own, taking the tourist train from St Helier Marina round the bay to St Aubin. Eventually, Dairne and I worked our way up the passerelle and had a really pleasant reunion with George, now 94, and Fay, who does not seem to age. As George and Fay could not manage the passerelle to get down to the boat, and Dairne and I did not fancy driving the wheelchair over the gravel drive at their house, we met in a cafe close to the marina. It had been an active day, so we were quite pleased to get back to the boat and relax for the rest of the evening. The previous evening I had been able to confirm that the period of settled weather would continue. There was nothing ominous in the Atlantic weather chart. The incredibly useful Météo France presentation indicated moderate winds for the next few days. More importantly, in the Météo France forecast, the roughness of the sea is divided into the two components of waves caused by the wind and the swell or houle that is so characteristic of the French Atlantic and Channel coasts. For the whole forecast period, swell and waves looked as though they would not be important. Our plan was to start the journey northwards with a stop at Dielette on the Normandy coast. I tried to develop the passage plan that would take us up the east coast of Jersey and past the Écreho, but Dielette is a half-tide marina and it proved difficult to work out a plan that matched the tide times. I had calculated that the gate into the marina at Dielette would open at 16:22, which was quite civilized. With the predicted west-northwesterly wind, it was likely to be uncomfortable if we had to wait outside Dielette for the gate to open. In the end I gave up and took the obvious route of carrying the tide from St Helier to Corbière at the southwest corner of Jersey before proceeding northwards to anchor off Sark, where we could wait for the tide into Dielette. It meant an early start, so I planned to wake the crew before 7, then take the boat out of the marina in St Helier to the waiting pontoon, where we could get organised before moving on. It was a beautiful morning when we motored gently out of the marina and made fast outside a beautiful Norwegian yacht that was on its way to Spain. After half an hour we were away again and speeding towards Noirmont Point, which we passed at 07:42. Then turning towards Corbière. We had a good push of tide helping us, but as this was in the face of the westerly wind, there was a little chop being kicked up and the yachts beating towards Corbière were having quite a bumpy time of it. Motorboats do point well. Once we had turned north, the wind and waves were no longer on the bow, so conditions became very pleasant. We were overtaken by the Condor Ro-Ro ship Commodore Goodwill. Although the visibility was excellent, there seemed to be a lot of distant haze about. As we approached Sark, we could see a large cruise ship in the little Russell Channel off St Peter Port. I was quite pleased that we were not in the port when all those passengers came ashore for the day. By 09:42 we entered Dairne Bay on the west side of Sark. It was almost completely calm and threatening to be very hot. There were a couple of boats already in the bay, but they soon left us in splendid isolation, apart from the disturbance caused by the occasional vedette, visitors to the cliff top, and of course the seabirds. We had a pleasant morning, enjoying the surroundings. Rowena braved the hot sunshine for a while, but Dairne and I preferred the shade of the cabin. After lunch, we weighed anchor at 14:45 and sped towards Dielette with the engines running at 2,300 revs, giving us about 15 knots. With the light breeze and the tiny wavelets behind us, this was the most comfortable passage we had made so far. By 1600 we were passing the nuclear power station at Cap de la Hague and slowing to allow a little more time for the gate to open. By 1635 we were secured on the pontoon at Dielette. I was delighted to see Andrew and Tanya Gardner in their boat St. Bridget a few berths along. Andrew is an ex-commodore of Marchwood Yacht Club and Tanya is an accomplished artist. Unlike the Channel Island marinas, we had not been met or directed to a berth, we simply picked the one we liked. So I found my way to the Capitanery for the formalities, where I was able to get a code for 8 hours free Wi-Fi and details of the free shuttle bus into the village. I had also noticed the bistro that is new since we had visited the port several years ago. We decided we would go there for a meal. This meant that Dairne had to get down onto the finger pontoon, which was fortunately quite wide and very stable. She then had to tackle the enormous passerelle while I pushed the wheelchair up it. We then enjoyed the biggest bowl of moules that I had seen since visiting Carteret 30 years earlier. We arranged with Andrew and Tanya that we would join them on the mid-morning shuttle bus into the village. That night was brilliantly clear with a full moon. While this can be a beautiful sight, it also indicated that we were very near to spring tides, so the currents in the Alderney race would be fierce. After breakfast the next morning, I was taking the rubbish to the Poole rubbish skip, when I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to change the clocks on board to French time. We were about to miss the bus. I rushed back to the boat. There was no way we were going to get the wheelchair and Dairne up to the bus in time, but we encouraged Rowena to go as quickly as possible. She was to have a very pleasant morning in the village, partly with Andrew and Tanya. Meanwhile, Dairne and I took our time getting to the top of the passerelle. Our intention was to try and walk to the village. We quickly realized that the footpaths up the hill to the village were gravel, which would be impossible for a wheelchair. Instead, we walked along the front quite a long way to see if we could find a restaurant where we could have lunch. The only possible candidate was closed, so we made our way back to the yacht club at the back of the marina, where we had enjoyed an excellent meal on our previous visit. We were just about the only visitors, which is a pity because the range and quality available far exceeded the bistro in the marina. Dairne feasted on crevette and bouleau at lunchtime, and I had a plate of giant gambas. We later heard that Rowena had only managed a cheese roll in the village. After lunch we made our way back to the boat and sheltered from the fierce sun. Rowena returned, and later that evening we entertained Andrew and Tanya on board for a glass of wine. Andrew and Tanya intended to go round to Cherbourg on the following morning, while we decided we would attempt the Channel crossing. The forecast was excellent, Meteo France indicating winds of force 3 or less and virtually no swell, while the inshore forecast for the English coast suggested very light winds with a sea state of smooth or slight. Our passage plan required an early start. This would enable us to go through the Alderney race with lots of favourable tide, and if all went well, we would reach the Needles Channel as the tide turned against us. Because of the strong tides on the Cherbourg side of the Alderney race, I set the route about 1/3 of the way across the race. If the race was benign, then I would be able to shape a course closer to the Cherbourg Peninsula. I discovered an interesting piece of software in the Navionics software on the chart plotter. Put in a route and select a date, and it would compute the total passage time given a starting time at each hour of that day. This suggested that the best time to leave would be 7 p.m. However, not only would that have given us a very late arrival, it would also mean that we would not be able to see the unmarked fishing floats that proliferate in the Solent area. The gate at Dielette would open at 6:30 in the morning, and if we left then, our passage time would be nearly as good. So it was that we woke early to a very sunny, still morning. The engines were started at 06:15, and soon we were emerging from the harbour onto a glassy flat sea. We were soon running at 2,300 revs, giving about 15 knots through the water. Rowena spotted a dolphin running alongside us, and soon there was a pod of 4 of them, keeping up easily with the boat. They were not with us for long, and I didn't have time or presence of mind to reach for the camera. There were great swirls of water as we went into the Alderney race, but it was completely flat, so we were able to edge closer to the Cherbourg peninsula than our planned route. Our speed over the ground edged rapidly up towards 20 knots. At one point we touched 21 knots. By 0800, the Needles Fairway buoy was 43.5 miles ahead on a bearing of 016 magnetic. As we pushed further north into the channel towards the shipping lanes, the visibility was strange, with a haze so strong that there was no clear horizon. The AIS was therefore extremely useful. The first ship to emerge from the mist was the Irish ferry Oscar Wilde, which was well south of the eastbound lane, clearly heading to Cherbourg. Not long afterwards we were able to identify the ship called Coolwater on the AIS plot and realised that it would pass fairly close but safely. Soon Coolwater emerged from the haze right where it should have been, heading towards us. There were quite a few yachts heading northwards across the channel. None had even bothered to try and set a sail, there was so little wind. This was definitely a day for a motorboat. It was incredibly calm, and we just sped along our way. When we reached the westbound shipping lane, we had to slow down and alter course to go around the stern of the Beaumar. We saw nothing more till we were about 15 miles from the Needles Fairway buoy. Then we saw the Brittany Ferries ship Barfleur heading south. Shortly after that, at 10:10, we could just make out the smudge of St Catherine's Point on a bearing of 062 magnetic at a range of 16 miles. Next we saw St Albans away to the northwest. Very slowly, Tennyson Down above the Needles appeared out of the murk. By 11:05, the Needles Fairway buoy was abeam. The visibility was clearer on this side of the channel, and we were still speeding along over glassy blue water. 10 minutes later, the bridge buoy was abeam, and we were heading back into the playpen of the Solent. Shortly after we passed Hurst Point, we began to encounter traffic, and the waves from the ferries and other motorboats were the biggest we had seen all day. We had managed to carry the tide all the way, and it was only just turning as we passed Yarmouth and worked our way up the Solent to Newtown. We anchored in Clamerkin Lake at 12:05 and settled down for a peaceful day in the beautiful sunshine. We had been extremely lucky with the weather. There now seems to be a family of 3 seals in Newtown. All that remained was a leisurely start next morning to take the tide up to Cowes, where we refuelled, getting back to Marchwood and on the mooring at 13:40. The total distance covered in the cruise was 293.7 miles. It was Rowena's birthday, so we celebrated with an end-of-cruise dinner at the Oak at Bank near Lyndhurst, returning on board for the night before packing up the following day.